Star Wars was obviously a huge mega hit in the United States from the time it first came out all the way through today. But did it ever catch fame in China? How is Star Wars seen halfway around the world in a very different culture? Join me now as we dive in to find the fascinating history of Star Wars in China. We're gonna have to go way back to just after World War II, so stick with me here. Don't worry, we'll get to Star Wars eventually. Now, as you may know, the Chinese Communist Party took control of the country in 1949, led by Chairman Mao Zedong. Rallying nationalism in opposition to China's past 100 years of incursion by foreign powers, Mao created heavy policies against foreign influence of any kind in his new China. Mao banned all foreign films from being shown there, as well as Chinese films made before 1949. Only films produced in China after the Communist Revolution were allowed in theaters. This strict policy continued through Mao's death in 1976 and was carried on by his successor Deng Xiaoping. A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back were both first released during this time period, so they were automatically banned in China. China's ban on foreign films continued until 1981, when China finally began slowly opening to the outside world. The first American films shown in China were a selection of only 5 classic movies, all approved by the Chinese government. This new openness to foreign films came just in time for the release of Return of the Jedi in 1983, but unfortunately for Star Wars, that movie did not make the cut. Which movies were shown in China at that time was entirely regulated by the government's decision on whether a film was culturally significant enough and in line with the ruling party's values. Return of the Jedi was considered neither, and only certain classic films were shown. But that didn't stop everyone. Many Chinese people in the 80s were able to illegally pick up VHS copies of the original trilogy, but nowhere near a majority. Most people simply had no idea Star Wars even existed back then. But the situation became even more dire in 1989, when Deng Xiaoping's government cracked down on foreign influence following the Tiananmen Square massacre, a crackdown that would continue until 1994. When China's ruling party decided that the financial gain of showing foreign films could outweigh the risk of ideological challenges, as long as they were regulated. So, a new policy was made, that foreign studios could release their movies in China as long as they got approval from the censors, cooperated with Chinese movie studios, and agreed to share their profits with the Chinese government. This is more or less the policy that still exists to this day, with some minor changes over the years. But with these changes came more international openness and a chance for Star Wars to finally reach Chinese audiences. The Phantom Menace was the first Star Wars movie officially shown in China. Released in 1999, The Phantom Menace didn't receive nearly as mixed reaction in China as it did in the US. But Chinese audiences also didn't love the movie as much as Japan had. The core 6 Star Wars movies all have similar 8 out of 10 ratings on the Chinese movie review site Douban. A solid B score across the board. Comments on the prequels often focused on its creative world building and the elements that Chinese audiences could relate to, such as the martial arts, Padme's Mongolian-style costumes, and the classic adventure story of 2 magical warriors and their bumbling friend fighting to save a village from evil invaders. The Phantom Menace actually pretty much follows a classic Chinese story structure from wuxia media, and that made it easier for Chinese audiences to relate to it. Even though the lack of focus on a main character and the side quest style plot were things that Western audiences often complained about. They were typical for Chinese stories of the time. Like everywhere else, audiences in China liked the prequels more as they went along, with everything culminating in the masterpiece that is Revenge of the Sith. But it wasn't the huge cultural landmark there that it was in the US, Japan, or other countries. Other than the most hardcore fans, the Chinese public just wasn't familiar with the original trilogy or its impact on the world, so they just watched the prequels as yet another random Hollywood action series from America. People there watched the prequels in theaters, saw the original trilogy on newly imported DVDs, and then waited with the rest of the world for Disney's new trilogy. As promotion for The Force Awakens, Disney released the original trilogy in Chinese theaters for the first time, in 2015, hoping to catch audiences up so that the general public would be excited about Star Wars. Disney spent a ton of money marketing in China, even to the point of officially streaming the first 6 Star Wars movies on Chinese websites for free, and marching 500 stormtroopers to the Great Wall of China. Disney tried really hard to make Star Wars a big deal in China. And it worked. For about 1 weekend. The Force Awakens had a huge opening weekend as people went to see what all the marketing hype was about, and then it immediately dropped off as people lost interest. Unlike the previous Star Wars movies, which received a consistent score of 8 from Chinese reviewers, The Force Awakens received only a 7 out of 10. Not terrible, but not good enough. Most reviewer reactions to the movie were focused on its strong similarities to A New Hope, the lack of depth and character, and the overall impression that the movie was boring compared to other American hits of the same year, such as Zootopia, World of Warcraft, and Captain America Civil War. Chinese audiences also disliked how much of a Mary Sue Rey was. Mary Sues are actually very common in Chinese media and something that the public has been increasingly sick of in recent years. But The Force Awakens box office in China dropped so precipitously after its first week that it was even surpassed by a local, low-budget Chinese animated kids movie called Boonie Bears 3. Yeah, the sequel trilogy didn't exactly help Star Wars' image for Chinese audiences. Rogue One struggled too, also reaching only a score of 7 out of 10 by reviewers, mostly due to the fact that people had a bad impression from The Force Awakens and the general public wasn't familiar enough with the original trilogy to care about or understand Rogue One's ending. As you might imagine, The Last Jedi similarly underperformed, getting another score of 7 out of 10. It performed so badly that it was completely pulled from Chinese theaters after only 2 weeks of showing. Disney's other Star Wars movies didn't receive high marks from Chinese reviewers either. Solo dropped to 6.8. Rise of Skywalker dropped to only 6.3. It wasn't even the #1 movie on its opening weekend. At least 3 other movies, all from Chinese studios, surpassed it. Star Wars had already been off to a rocky start in China, and the new Disney films were only sinking in lower. But there's still hope. The Mandalorian gets incredibly positive reviews by Chinese audiences, with online reviewer scores of 9.2 and 9.4 out of 10 for their first 2 seasons. The Clone Wars and The Bad Batch similarly hold high ratings around 9 out of 10, likely due to their straightforward, compelling stories and the way that they tie directly into the prequels, which were the most popular in China. So, if Disney really wants to break Star Wars into the Chinese market, it looks like they're at least on the right track. It seems that everyone around the globe is unified in wanting more of Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau's ever-growing Star Wars universe. So, here's to hoping that things keep improving.
在成为《星球大战前传》成年版的安纳金后，海登一夜之间成为好莱坞最热门的闪亮新星。随着影片的热映，这个之前默默无闻的年轻人一飞冲天，成为好莱坞巨星。然而，在影片开拍之初，启用一个新人饰演安纳金，乔治·卢卡斯的这一选择，曾使得电影界一片愕然。